Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are at the moment. My name is Jeroen De Ridder. I'm a researcher at the Amsterdam University Medical Center and at the Vrije University. And today I'm very happy to be here present at the summer seminar on research integrity, day 2. Yesterday we have discussed a lot of things about what can individual researchers do to foster research integrity. And today the main topic, what we're going to discuss, is what can research institutes and funders do to foster research integrity. And I'm very happy that we have a beautiful program with 8 experts in the field that are going to tell us everything about what research institutes can do, but also what funders can do. Additionally to these 8 speakers, we have 3 pitches that are going to discuss in just 5 minutes some early work that they have conducted in the past years. Also very excited to see that. And as you can see here on screen, we have a lively program with a lot of interesting topics that we're going to discuss. Some rules are important to discuss. Of course, we would have hoped that this was a meeting where everyone was around, that we had a vivid audience, but unfortunately still we have to manage that it's an online format. That does not take away that we have a lot of opportunities to interact with the speakers, specifically for the audience. Please send out your queries, your questions, your suggestions in the Q&A in the Zoom meeting. We have an online moderator, that's Iris Lechner, and she will send to me all the questions. I have here an iPad, and I can see your questions, and I will ask them to the speakers that we have today. So that's an important thing. Some other logistics for today is that all the videos will be recorded and will be posted online in September. Also the presentation slides. And we end the day with a panel discussion where we invite all the speakers to come to stage online or here live, and we will have a discussion where we use a poll that you have to fill in to see to further discuss how we can further foster research integrity in institutes and in funders. So those are the logistics for today. And I'm very happy to announce the first speaker then. She's already on stage next to me. That's Mariëtte van der Hoven. She is a professor in philosophy of medicine and ethics at the Amsterdam University Medical Center. She is also the department head, recently appointed here in Amsterdam. I'm very happy that she's here today. She's coordinating a Horizon 2020 project on research integrity, focusing on the development of responsible conduct of research education. And to be honest, I think it really fits her character well, the topic that she is investigating, because as she is looking for the positive side of research integrity education, as is her character, because she is a very positive-minded person that always looks at the positive side of research and also at the positive side of humans. So I'm very happy that you are here today to talk about the responsible conduct of research in education, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. You make me blush already, and that's just the beginning of the day. So I want to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity, and I think that you've organized a wonderful event with multiple participants, huge numbers, and I think that we have learned through COVID that we can actually interact very well from all over the world. So thank you very much for that. Given the topic of today, what can institutions do? I think that my project, and I'm happy to present something on a European project that we are currently running, Our focus, or my focus in this talk will indeed be on RCR education. The title of the talk is The Impact of Positive Approaches Towards RCR Education in Practice. And it immediately gives away that I'm focusing on a very particular field in the area of research integrity education, namely RCR education, which is indeed taking a positive approach because RCR, as you know, stands for Responsible Conduct of Research. This project is, together with another project that will be presented after the lunch, one of the there are a few examples of European projects that particularly focus more on building and creating and developing new sorts of trainings that can be used and implemented and embedded in institutions in European universities. So that's the context, I think, where I fit in today's topic. So let me give you a bit of a background on RCR. So I already told you RCR is a very specific subdomain, you could say, in the field of research integrity education, and it has been developed since the 90s, actually last century. But to be honest, it has mainly been boosted in the United States of America because there they had, since the 90s, an obligation for everyone who would receive a national grant from one of the national funding agencies to be trained in research integrity due to the number of cases of misconduct that was also brought to light, and people decided that that was necessary to do. And you can imagine that if there is an obligation to teach research integrity, that will boost the development of such courses. And in Europe, I already told you, there are now a number of projects running, and I think that will boost within the European context in a similar way, the teaching and embedding of such training within different universities and faculties. If you look more closely at the bulk of literature that can be found on RCR education, then you see there is a wide variety of types of courses. The length of these courses varies greatly, so it could be a public lecture of 30 minutes, but it could also involve something like a number of weeks or months even, and the working methods also differ greatly. And that's also understandable. Everyone who is responsible for conducting such teachings within their own university or faculty will develop it on their own, given the possibilities and options that they have. But this immediately raises, of course, a question, what actually works? What will impact, and that's the title of my topic, what will impact in the most positive way these types of teachings? And to be honest, and that might be a bit disappointing, we simply do not know what works best. And that's not the end message, that's just the starting point for the talk, actually, and also the starting point for the project that we are running. Because there are a number of things that we do know, and we still do not know much, but we do know a lot already. And in the context of the project that we are running, the Integrity Project, we have been trying to peel down what kind of factors, what kind of characteristics of types of RCR education seem to be more or less promising if you put them in a specific context. And what we have done, there are recently have been published a number of meta-reviews on the successes and the impact of research integrity education, RCR education more specifically, and we have been peeling down for you in an Excel file. You can find it on our project website, and the project website is at the last slide of my presentation, so you can always look it up. It's an Excel file where we actually present to you in a more descriptive way what characteristics of these types of education have been researched so far, and that can vary from factors that have to do with either is it a mandatory course or a voluntary course, is it taught by an experienced teacher or not, what kind of topics on RCR are being addressed, so all kinds of different factors that are not even always closely related directly to RCR topics as such. And I think that's quite understandable because for all education it goes that a number of other variables are always relevant, like for example, how many hours are being taught, what kind of working methods are being used. So what works can be found in at least this Excel file. I invite you to have a look at it. We also compared it to something else, namely the predictive modeling tool, which is also a really helpful instrument for people who are in the process of designing their own courses. And it's also meant to be helpful to figure out which variables are most relevant to you, or given the fact that you already have a course that you are teaching, to determine which are more or less successful factors without doing the research on your own. Yes, yet we have to be modest. So what we also did is have a more closer look at all these review studies. There are 12 review studies currently being published. And if you take a real close look at these, we have defined some hypotheses to test the robustness of some of the conclusions that they arrived at. So for example, one thing that many people tend to think is that in RCR courses, using case studies is the best thing to do. So everyone is very much in favor of case studies, including myself. But if you test the hypothesis if the underlying literature and the studies and the research being done on RCR education actually supports this, then the answer needs to be no. Sorry, we cannot find any robust evidence that that is indeed the case. That doesn't say that case studies are not really helpful, but we haven't proven yet that in the context of RCR education for the studies that have been conducted, that it is indeed the best way to teach RCR. Okay, having said that, and wanting to have impact in developing research or educational tools on our own in our project, we decided to take a different approach, because we think that the ultimate key to develop and teach RCR education is actually to align the learning objectives that you formulate with the content of your courses and the evaluation of your courses. Because one thing that becomes clear in all these studies and these meta-reviews is that there is such a huge variety in learning objectives. You can stimulate knowledge on, for example, codes of conduct. You can stimulate skills, reflective skills, but you can also, and that's what many people obviously also try to do, want to stimulate a different attitude towards RCR, or you want to stimulate something like different behavior. And that's, of course, less easy to measure behavior. So what we did in the project is actually taking this idea of fostering research integrity, which is core to RCR, as a starting point for a teaching philosophy that we wanted to build, and we combined that with the perspective of empowerment. We used this concept of empowerment. And then we defined a few characteristics, because our basic idea in the project was that we need to build capacities of researchers, not provide them with some knowledge, but to build capacities so that they are able to function well, both individually, but also in collectives within institutional systems and within bigger systemic contexts. Empowerment, this notion refers to something like learning to take control. So that's a really relevant characteristic for the way that we approach RCR education. And it's also about learning to develop a critical autonomy. So it's about developing if you talk about critical autonomy, it's like a bulk concept, but it at least refers to something like self-reflective attitude, or an ability to deliberate independently, or being able to evaluate contexts of research on your own, and being able also to develop strategies to deal with these contexts where you are confronted with. And even more, it's not only about gaining knowledge and learning skills, but it's also about stimulating people to feel up, to act upon their decisions. So don't stand still, but become proactive, and stimulating an attitude of openness and courage. Well, these are just some examples of what we ultimately developed in a competence profile that I will tell you a bit more about in a minute. Why did we decide to take this concept of empowerment? Because empowerment too is like a bulk concept, that a kind of an umbrella concept, many people say, and it's a really strong concept, but why would this be useful? Well, we took this actually from Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire in the 70s in Brazil wrote this famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he presented, even though he never mentioned the word empowerment himself, he presented this idea that there are systems of oppression ongoing where people are either oppressed or oppressors, and we need to abandon that system. We need to become aware of the fact that we are sometimes stuck in a system where we cannot escape. And to him, the main purpose of human beings is to seek human flourishing, and human flourishing can only occur if you become aware of your own position and become able to liberate yourself from these systematic pressures that are ongoing. So it will not help in his perspective to simply lift up the people who are now oppressed or are being pressured towards certain behavior. For example, to lift up the worst off in the system, because then the oppressed become oppressors and nothing actually changes. And here you immediately see some overlap with our research integrity debates, I think. We often talk about how systems need to change, and that we need to liberate and become more aware of pressures that are ongoing that tend to lead people astray from responsible conduct and behavior. So to Paulo Freire, this was clear. It requires an attitude of equality of all people, a dialogical approach where people learn to be open to each other, and this requires an awareness and development of a critical attitude. The concept of empowerment is also well known from Michel Foucault. We also use that, but a bit more on the side, because Freire has been inspiring very much for the field of educational sciences, and that because we were developing education, we focused mainly on him. But Foucault too, he stresses that power relations are inherent to all people's actions, and that we need to become aware of these power relations before we actually can make any changes. So if we try to find the overlap, then the characteristics of RCR that we found that we deemed relevant and the concept of empowerment led to some core focal points in our approach to develop educational tools and modules. First, we want to take a positive approach, so we don't want to punish or warn people, but we want to help them to do things right. It's taking the positive approach, standing together with researchers, young researchers, students, and help them to see and understand and reflect on the issues that are relevant in research practices and research projects. It's also about taking a proactive attitude. Sometimes I use the term bystander, active bystander, but it's about increasing your awareness, and you have to learn to see what issues are ongoing. You have to learn to be more open and dare to discuss. Sometimes it takes a bit of courage to actually learn to address these issues. So it's not simply about telling people how good research is done, but it's helping them to actually start critically reflect on their own and become self-standing researchers in practice, also with regards to responsible conduct of research. We focus more on daily practices, therefore, because it makes sense to align with the experiences that people have, even within high schools where you are prepared to start an academic career. And we are offering strategies. We think it's important to offer strategies for action and assistance. So not to stand still after you have offered some reflective skills, but also to challenge people to think of strategies and to become more proactive. So to us, this all naturally evolved into what we call a competence profile. So we have developed this teaching philosophy that I just mentioned with these core characteristics that are aligned with the work of Paulo Freire, but also with the concepts of RCR that you can find in the literature. And then we developed a competence profile. And this competence profile actually explicates which core knowledge, skills and behavioral or attitudinal aspects are expected of responsible researchers. And this is a list that we made. I didn't show the list because it's quite dense, but you can always find it on our website or send me an email and I'll send it to you. And based on that, we have developed several educational tools. And this is the last part of my talk. I'm going to simply tell you now and give you some examples of how we develop that into various tools. So the first box cell says various tools, but it actually misses the word high school students. We have developed course materials both for high school students, undergraduate students in universities, and PhDs. And that's interesting because many people say, why high school students? But we think that you can align their experiences also with the discussions and some of the topics that you encounter in research integrity. So what we did, for example, is plagiarism that quite frequently occurs in the musical industry, to compare that with plagiarism in the field of research integrity. And we tested these tools in Ireland, Slovenia, and Portugal. We A very interesting other tool is for undergraduate students. It's an integrity case generator. It's a web-based narrative where students are led through a narrative with different cases and decisions that they need to make, and they also see the consequences of the decisions that they make. And it's a really interesting and interactive tool that has currently been tested in Denmark and Hungary. If you're interested, you can always contact me about any of these tools. And for PhDs particularly, we actually developed small private online courses, which was really helpful in the time that we were confronted with COVID, because online tools, online modules can always be taught, and we had some very interesting course runs, 12 tests in the end, with PhD students coming from all over Europe. We decided to have small private online courses where we focus on particular topics like authorship and publication, or a topic on collaboration and supervision, or on the role that data plays in your research. And we always align this with the specific projects and experiences that students, PhD students have on their own. We will also develop for everyone publicly available a MOOC that will be ready at the end of this year. And we are in the process of finishing a small private online course also for supervisors, where we use very interesting videos that we recorded with actors. So, I'm ending with 2 sample materials that I wanted to show you, because we think that empowering via education should also be done in a fun way to stimulate reflection. For example, we use cartoons to reflect, to stimulate reflection among PhD students about the way they are being supervised. And we ask them to characterize the way that they are being supervised, and if that lives up to their expectations or not. And we offer them 9 different cartoons, and it really works well. And it's a fun assignment actually for them to do. And the last example that I want to present to you is that we developed a reflection model. It resembles, for those of you who know moral case deliberation, it resembles those types of step-by-step approaches that are well known in the field of moral case deliberation. And you see here on the screen a video, but it's just a picture of the video. We offer them a small presentation, and we offer them a model to help them discuss cases on their own, and it has proven to be a really helpful model to them to address very specific issues that are relevant. And at the end of the model, we ask them, what kind of strategy will you develop to actually do something about this situation? So there it shows again how we think that a proactive attitude can be stimulated. So these are 2 examples, and I've shown you the way how we've built from a teaching philosophy where we want to make the impact on education in such a way that we think that it needs to align very well with the learning objectives that you formulate, towards how you actually substantially build a course. And now we're in the process of analyzing the data, so I'm unfortunate and cannot show you that already. And I want to finish off, if I'm allowed to, Yuri, with 2 other events that we are organizing within the project, to which I warmly invite you to attend. We will organize a dîner pensant for everyone who is involved in research. It's an online event due to COVID, but I think it's going to be the best and fun event that we've organized in the project, where we will have discussions on research integrity together. And there is a student convention upcoming, so if you have any students, either high school students, undergrads, or PhD students who would like to attend, please go to our website and subscribe to the events. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you have some interesting questions.
Well, Mariëtte, thank you very much for this great overview about the positive approach towards responsible conduct of research education. I'm very happy. I think this is, from my perspective, I think it's really novel to have this approach in education, because normally we have a very not so interactive sessions, and luckily it's changing a lot, that it's so much more interactive, but you're really putting the person who receives the education on the pedestal to empower themselves, actually, and that teachers need to empower them and not teach, not so much, well, do focus on the content, but focus merely on the reflections that the person should develop. It was also a little bit puzzling for me. I heard a lot of new terms: SPOCs, MOOCs, dîner pensant. You have videos, you have cartoons. So there's a lot of material being produced. Yeah. What, of course, what do you think will have the most effect?
I don't know, but I know that these POCs function like regular courses and then online. And the fun thing is that we had really very interdisciplinary and international groups of students participating, and they learned mostly from each other. So the feedback that we received from them was, because they were in a closed environment with only 20 people doing the same course at the same time, they really enjoyed the experiences and the differences that other people experience in their own context. So someone from educational sciences with a neurobiologist and someone from psychology, they have different stories to tell, and that in itself is really enlightening to them. So to cross the boundaries of your own research group, your own research practice, and I think that in the Netherlands we have learned from the Diederik Stapel case that you should never only focus on your own research group, because then you become blindsided, and here I think that was the greatest benefit.
Yeah. Thank you very much. 2 questions that already came in. The first is a very practical one and an easy one. So that's from Savik Das Gupta. How can we get access to the modules prepared for PhDs and supervisors? Do we just email Mariëtte?
Yes, you just email me.
Okay, that was an easy one, right? And the other one is Marta de Boer. I'm happy that you address undergraduate students. Do you also include applied university students in your courses? And if not, what is your thought about working with HBO students, so that's the applied university students and research integrity?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that you asked this question. We are currently also developing, and within the universities of applied sciences, they already have a project running. And I know that Julia Priest-Boegheid, after the lunch, will also say something about it because she works at a Hochschule. Certainly, that's and the interesting thing about universities of applied sciences is that students are often actively involved via the research groups to also actively participate in research. So I think that's an extra dimension. And the second extra dimension here is that there's a lot of practical research together with organizations where you also have internships. So that's an extra interesting element, I think, to these specific universities.
Thank you very much. I had also a question myself, and that's alluding to the discussion that we had yesterday about mandatory versus optional, about carrots, about sticks. And of course, well, this positive approach is, of course, it sounds like it's so much more focusing on optional and autonomy, and not so much about the sticks and the mandatory things. Happy to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I definitely take the positive approach, and then I mean that it doesn't make any sense to students who are still learning to do some research and how to do research well, to immediately warn them that they should not cross the borders, cross the lines, because they will not identify. It's juicy to hear about Diederik Stapel, but they will not immediately identify themselves with this person because he has been the great example of misconduct. So there's a difficulty that you need to overcome. In order to motivate students, I think you should therefore take the positive approach and help them to think with them, along with them, how they can learn to do things right. And in a survey that we had in the project, we also found this. So many students tend to think that they know already everything about research integrity, even high school students, and they know that plagiarism is not okay. But if you show them an example, they cannot distinguish plagiarism from non-plagiarism. So that proves that you need to learn to help them to actually do things right. Yeah.
So it's not per se bad to do something mandatory.
No, about mandatory, yeah, that's in the review studies that we found, you see that sometimes the impact is negative if it's a mandatory course, but that doesn't say, that's not the end to the discussion. And I think that many of these mandatory courses can be fun as well. So we're also developing an escape room right now for research master students, which will be a fantastic experience if I were a research master student. I would love it. So you can make it more fun even if it's mandatory, and make it more relevant even if it's mandatory.
Okay, that sounds, by the way, that sounds very interesting. One final question before we go to the next speaker. And then also a very interesting one. How can you elaborate? Can you elaborate on how to empower supervisors, and perhaps your thoughts on how to get them to do the course in the first place?
Maybe we should take all these courses as mandatory courses for supervisors as well. You see that the discussion within many universities is actually ongoing about making the courses for when you start as a supervisor more mandatory, because it's not obvious that if you have been supervised yourself that you are a good supervisor per se. So that's something that you can learn, and also that you can develop yourself a bit, more in. So that's, I think, already acknowledged in some universities, and it's growing. And I think the main thing that needs, so the empowerment that's relevant to students is also relevant to supervisors, because we're all in the same kind of research practice and the same kind of system. So a senior researcher might also feel sandwiched between the publication pressure and the institutional regulations. And here it's also opening up, learning to discuss things with your PhDs is really helpful. To give you an example, in one of these POCs, we actually have the assignment that you have to arrange a meeting with your supervisor about RCR topics that are bothering to you or that seem relevant to you. And then often the order of authorship or authorship as such is being discussed. And the students have to report back at the end of the course about this conversation. And quite frequently they feel relieved that they had this conversation, that they see that their supervisor is also a simple human being. And that they never realized that these types of topics that can also be addressed and openly discussed. And it really opens up things.
Yeah, I see something in front of me that you put a supervisor with his or her PhD student in an escape room to talk about research integrity. I think that's, I think in a nutshell,
that would be a wonderful idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, please give Mariëtte a warm round of applause, online applause though. Thank you so much for being here and for giving this elucidating talk. We go to the next speaker. Thank you. Okay, now I'm very happy to announce the next speaker, which is Jeroen De Ridder. He's an associate professor at my university, the Vrije Universiteit, Department of Philosophy, but also a professor by special appointment at the University of Groningen. Apart from that, he's also the president of the Young Academy. His research is focusing on social epistemology and philosophy of science, and specifically on the epistemology of beliefs, where he questions if there are collective intellectual virtues in groups. I'm and this is of course highly relevant in this specific Corona era, where there are a lot of self-appointed experts and a lot of opinions in the field that may not be constructive for fighting the pandemic. Apart from that, he's a great teacher, and he's also an example in transparent leadership. I'm very happy that he's going to talk about the value of the code, what kinds of value are there in codes of conduct. So welcome, Jeroen, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Yuri, for that lovely introduction. You were being way too generous with me. So I'm going to talk about the sorts of values that we find in codes of conduct for responsible conduct of research, or research integrity, if you will. And what I'm presenting today is actually joint work with a number of my colleagues. I think all of whom you've met yesterday. So Rick Peels, Tamarinde Hoven, and Lex Bouter, we worked together on this paper. And the paper, if you're interested, can be found online. The reference is there on this slide, and it's entitled Value Pluralism in Research Integrity. So you may have heard the following description of philosophy. So it's by Wilfrid Sellars, the well-known philosopher of science. So the goal of philosophy, he says, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of that term. And in a way, this paper arose out of this goal. So what we were trying to do is really to get an understanding of what research integrity is and how the various elements of it hang together with each other. And for me as a philosopher, and for my colleagues who are also philosophers, this is an interesting intellectual puzzle, but in the end, we also think it makes a practical difference if we understand better what is involved in research integrity. But I'll return to the practical implications towards the end of my talk. So I'm guessing that this needs no introduction in this audience, but on the next slide, you can see that there are by now a number of codes of conduct for responsible conduct of research, and they've been developed over the past decades in response to highly publicized cases of misconduct and fraud. And a lot of effort has been put into thinking through what is the elements of responsible conduct of research. And to some extent, they've been codified in various codes. So we decided for this project to take a look at, well, I wouldn't quite say it's sort of a representative sample, but at least we've looked at a broad sample of codes that have been on the market for some time. So on the next slide, you'll see which codes we looked at. And the criteria that we used for looking into these codes were basically that they had to be more or less recent, or at any rate, they had to be the latest version of that particular code. We aimed for geographical spread, so codes from different parts of the world. And we checked to make sure that they were all independent. So we didn't include codes that were based on each other or sort of translations of each other. So the sample that we used is there on the slide. So the European Code of Conduct, the Netherlands Code of Conduct. We looked at actually 2 combined codes from Brazil, and then a code from Japan, one from Australia, Zimbabwe, and Canada. So a fairly broad sample from different parts of the world. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we found many different sorts of things in these codes. And I'll just show you one example on the next slide from the Dutch Code of Conduct. Here's the list of the central principles, as they were called in that code, for research integrity. So they're honesty and scrupulousness, reliability, verifiability, impartiality, independence, and responsibility. And I think, this is sort of a mistake on my part. I think I forgot to update the slides because these are actually the principles from the 2014 version, whereas the 2018 version has 5 principles. So it's slightly different. So I apologize for not including the latest version of the code here. And we find sort of roughly similar values, norms, and principles in other codes. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but just to give you an impression of the sort of things that you'll find here. Now, the first thing that struck us when we looked at these various codes was that sort of their central elements actually have rather different labels. So some of the codes talk about values, others talk about norms, yet others talk about principles. Some describe practical guidelines. Some talk about virtues, moral or epistemic virtues, best practices. And some include violations or lists of violations. Now, all these things are related to each other in various ways. Many people say that values are sort of more general and then norms or principles follow from those. And perhaps best practices are sort of practices in which a number of principles are combined in a particularly good way. But it's not obvious that these are all the same thing. So that's the first sort of pluralism that we found. There's sort of pluralism in the sense that we have values, norms, principles, guidelines, virtues, and so on. Now, might not be a problem, and maybe this is all fine, but at least it's something to be aware of, that different codes use these different labels or concepts to explicate what research integrity is. On the next slide, you'll see what we think is a more interesting version of pluralism. So it turns out that when you look closely at what's actually in these codes, so the actual substance of what they say, you'll find roughly 5, at least we identified 5 categories of different sorts of values or norms or principles. So there are epistemic values, so values having to do with the production and distribution of knowledge. There are moral values, so principles, values having to do with what's right and wrong, to do. There are professional values, so values that have to do with sort of a useful or a prudent or a good way of organizing the profession of research or academia more broadly. There are social values having to do with the place of research and science in society. And we found examples of legal values. So values having to do with the law, obviously. Now, we're not necessarily claiming that all of these different categories are entirely independent. So often it will be the case that a professional value or a social value also has moral dimensions, and especially sort of well-established professional principles. If you violate those, there will be sort of moral reproach. But in principle, at least these 5 categories can be distinguished analytically. So let me give you an example of what we found in the Dutch Code for Research Integrity. So here are some of the things that you'll find under the heading of honesty and scrupulousness. So what we thought was a clearly epistemic norm. So present the nature and scope of results with the greatest possible precision. So that clearly seems to have to do with the value of knowledge, right? We want to be as accurate and precise as possible in order not to mislead people, in order to present only true beliefs and avoid false beliefs. So an epistemic value or principle. Also moral values principles, so respect for the people and animals involved in scientific teaching and research. Scrupulousness also applies to relationships, and that's sort of to people relationships, interhuman relationships. Professional norms. Accurate source references provide a clear indication of the intellectual provenance of cited and paraphrased text. So why do we call this a professional norm? Well, I mean, strictly speaking, the way we cite other people's work and refer to other people's work, I mean, there could be multiple ways of doing it, but the way that most researchers in academia use is by offering these bibliographies and citations. So that's a professional norm. It's just sort of a professional rule. This is the way we give credit to each other's work. I mean, it isn't clear that this is a strictly epistemic value, right? I mean, it's not clear that we produce more knowledge because we do this accurately. It's a professional norm, sort of courtesy to other researchers. Similarly, good mentorship is essential. Responsibilities are clearly defined and observed. Also, perhaps, I mean, certainly professional, perhaps also partly moral, right? Because you might argue that a mentorship relation also has clear interhuman and moral dimensions. But at any rate, you'll find these norms and principles from these 5 different categories. And this is an example from the Dutch Code. I mean, in the paper, we have examples from other codes as well. And most of the time, there is no real problem in this. So it's just sort of an analytical or theoretical observation, if you will, that there are these different kinds of values and principles in codes. But sometimes these different principles or these principles from different categories can pull in different directions and come into conflict. And I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. So this is from the European code. So on the one hand, we find epistemic norms for openness and transparency. So for example, researchers, research institutions, and organizations ensure access to data is as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So it's sort of a carefully qualified principle, but still, we want as much openness as possible. On the other hand, there are sort of legal or professional norms for privacy and sometimes secrecy. For example, researchers publish results and interpretations of research in an open, honest, transparent, and accurate manner, and respect confidentiality of data or findings when legitimately required to do so. So also here, we see sort of a carefully qualified formulation, but the point is, these 2 things can clearly pull in different directions, right? For the production of knowledge, it's imperative that we be as open as possible. But sometimes for legal or professional reasons, there are imperatives to keep things secret. Sometimes having to do with privacy. So perhaps there's also a moral dimension to this. Sometimes simply having to do with sort of contractual obligations, so legal obligations. Now, the tricky point is, it's not so clear that we can make a principled trade-off between these things. I mean, so what we argue in the paper is that there is, in fact, no principled way to make this trade-off, or at least there is no generally applicable way to make that trade-off. So there is no sort of general rule that we can use that's going to apply to all conflicts between epistemic and legal norms, or even the specific conflict between this epistemic and that legal norm that we have here. So we call this in the paper incommensurable values, and that's sort of a fancy philosopher's term to say, it's a mathematical term originally, but philosophers use it a lot too. Anyway, so incommensurable means there is no common yardstick or currency or measure into which both values can be converted so that their relative importance or weight can be compared directly, which is sort of a convoluted way of saying there's no principled way to make the trade-off. So that's a sort of a practical difficulty. If you want to apply these codes, sometimes you're going to run into these conflicts between incommensurable values and norms, and there's no recipe that you can apply each time you run into a conflict like that in order to solve it. So it needs sort of careful judgment, sort of careful weighing of the different norms in that particular situation. No general solution there. All right, a further instance of value pluralism on the next slide has to do with the fact that sometimes even within one of these 5 broad categories that I identified before, we have multiple values. So for instance, in the category of epistemic values, here are some of the things that at least epistemologists think or have argued are epistemic values. So we value true belief, or the truth, if you will. But we also value the avoidance of false belief. We value well-grounded or justified or supported belief, right? We don't just believe things for no reason whatsoever. I mean, especially in research and science, we want good grounds, good justifications for what we believe. Things like knowledge, understanding, or even more ambitiously, wisdom. I mean, perhaps not many people would think that science can give you wisdom. Maybe that's a bit ambitious. I mean, maybe philosophy can, although that's doubtful too. Oftentimes we cause more confusion than wisdom, I will readily admit. At any rate, I mean, these are typically seen as epistemic values too. Now, the mere fact that there are these different values might not be so bad, but here too, these different values within one category can come into conflict with each other. Let me give you an example of that on the next slide. So, conflicting epistemic norms. So I said before, we value true belief. So we value having as much true beliefs as we can, but we also value the avoidance of false belief, right? So we don't want to believe a lot of things that are false. And we find both of these things encoded in different principles. So here are some examples. We see an imperative to present the nature and scope of results with the greatest possible precision. So presumably that has to do with getting more and more accurate true beliefs. Precision and nuance in teaching, publishing, and knowledge transfer. I mean, that too, to be precise and nuanced, probably that serves the goal of avoiding false beliefs and maximizing the amount of true beliefs that people get from science, from research. Presentation of doubts and contraindicators. So be explicit and be clear about doubts and worries and sort of conflicting evidence. Again, has to do with sort of true belief versus false belief. Speculation spurred by results of academic research is recognizably presented as such. So that's interesting, right? Scientists shouldn't just sort of make wild extrapolations or speculations from their results and then claim the same level of certainty for those things. They should be explicit when they're speculating. And why is that? Well, because we want to be careful about what is presented as true and we want to avoid false beliefs. Publication should make mention of the statistical uncertainty of research results and the margins of error. Well, similar thing there. So why do I say that these things can come into conflict? Well, I mean, if you think about it, if we are interested in maximizing our stock of true beliefs, the best thing we can do is to just believe everything, right? So every claim whatsoever, we'll just believe it, because that way we'll end up believing everything that's true. I mean, we'll also get a lot of false beliefs, but at least we're believing everything that's true. So sort of a strict interpretation of the goal of maximizing your stock of true beliefs will lead you to believe everything. On the other hand, if we really insist that we want to avoid all false beliefs, what we should do is just believe nothing, right? Because that way we will not have any false beliefs. And I mean, so maybe it's helpful to point out that this is sort of similar to the familiar distinction between type 1 and type 2 errors in statistics, right? And there's a similar sort of trade-off there. If you want to avoid all false positives, that's going to come at the cost of allowing more false negatives. And the other way around too. If we want to avoid all false negatives, we're going to get more false positives in our methodological designs. So there's a trade-off here. So we have multiple values within one category of epistemic values, and they come into conflict. They pull in different directions. And again, it looks like there is no principled general way to make that trade-off between these different values that's going to work in all cases where they come into conflict. So again, we'll need to look closely at the details of the case and weigh the different values in that particular instance. I mean, is it more important for this particular research project to avoid type 1 errors or to avoid type 2 errors? I mean, that might depend on the social context, on the consequences of a false positive versus a false negative. I mean, how dangerous are they? How impactful could they be? I mean, these are all things that have to go into our weighing of these different and conflicting values. All right, so another example from the category of moral values and norms on the next slide. We have norms for transparency and also norms for privacy. So the examples there on the slide: research methodology, research findings and knowledge will be shared and communicated openly. So this is a norm clearly having to do with openness and transparency from the Australian Code. Disclose and manage actual, potential, or perceived conflicts of interest, also a norm for transparency. The researcher must maintain the confidentiality of all data, information, procedures, and partial results until the final results and of the study are published. So this is from the Brazil Code, or one of the Brazil codes. So a norm for a certain degree of secrecy or privacy. Provisions for protecting the confidentiality of personal data and respecting the privacy of subjects. So, I mean, perhaps by now, sort of my line will be familiar. Here too, we have moral norms, one set of norms or one principle having to do with openness and transparency that pulls in one direction, the other having to do with privacy, secrecy, pulls in the other direction. Again, there's no general recipe for resolving potential conflicts and tensions between these norms. So we need to look at a case-by-case basis for how we want to resolve these conflicts. So again, an example of a conflict within one category, multiple values. All right, so that brings me to sort of my theoretical conclusions. So I started by saying we want to understand how the various elements of research integrity hang together in the broadest possible sense of that term. Well, what we found is there is value pluralism in research integrity. We have different categories of values, so these 5 categories that we identified. And that's all well and good. I mean, sometimes we can simply respect all these different values, but in other cases, there is conflict between these values or the specific principles that fall under these values. They can come into conflict. And what's even more difficult, sometimes these values are incommensurable. So we don't have a yardstick or one common measure into which we can translate these different principles in order to weigh their respective importance or demandingness. So in the paper, we also look at a number of attempts to get rid of this pluralism. So we consider the question whether it's possible to somehow reason your way out of the pluralism, so to rank the different sorts of values perhaps in a plausible way, and so that you can then derive from that ranking a recipe for resolving potential conflicts or genuine conflicts. But we argue that none of these attempts really work, but I'll skip that part here. So let me close by getting back to the practical relevance of everything I've been trying to say. So why is it helpful to understand what research integrity is and how sort of the different elements of it hang together? Well, for one reason, this is something philosophers like to say, so I apologize for saying it again. I mean, maybe you've heard more philosophers say it, but I mean, we think clarity and systematicity is a good thing, right? I mean, at least to a point, right? We want things to be as clear and systematic as they can. Of course, I mean, the real world and research integrity in particular is a complex thing, is a complex phenomenon. But that doesn't mean our codification of what it is needs to be more messy and more convoluted than strictly necessary. So we think getting clearer on these different categories of values and possible conflicts within these categories and the different sort of sub-values within the categories can help in improving these codes and improving their systematicity and clarity. And that's going to be helpful in actually using them and applying them, because it helps us to get rid of unnecessary plurality. I mean, sometimes maybe there's overlap and there are sort of more things in there than is strictly necessary. I mean, you might wonder, do we really need both values and norms and principles and virtues and guidelines and best practices? It seems like a lot, right? Maybe we can do better by simply reducing that plurality. Another thing that we think might be a possible payoff of thinking through these codes is that it can help us to identify potential blind spots in some of these codes. So if it turns out that some of the codes that are out there lack certain categories of values or specific values within a particular category, then if you have this systematic overview of the different elements and categories that there are in research integrity, that can be helpful, right? Because you can identify these blind spots. It also helps to recognize and navigate trade-offs between value conflicts and incommensurable values. So I think I've emphasized that enough in the talk already by giving you these examples. So the final point is, I think what this brings out is a need for intellectual humility, as we called it, and context-sensitive interpretation and judgment in, well, both in developing these codes, sort of writing them up, but also in applying them, and especially when it comes to contexts in which we are trying to apply them for people who seem to have violated these codes, right? Oftentimes, there are different values at stake, there can be conflicts between them, and it's not a sort of a simple and straightforward thing to make an accurate judgment as to whether or not a violation was very severe, whether it was avoidable, whether it was intentional or not. So all of these things are going to have to count into our judgment of possible breaches of codes of conduct. All right, that's it. The final slide shows the acknowledgements, so I'll leave it at that. And back to you, Yuri.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, for this elucidating talk. I think we know more about codes right now, but I think we also are still a bit confused, although you opt for less clearance and a systematic approach. And I think that's something not only philosophers want. I'm, as a psychiatrist myself, I really want to clear the minds of my patients as well. And I think in psychology and all research elements, I think we really want systematic approaches and clear vision. So luckily, that's not only something that philosophers want, and I think it's good that you highlight this again, because with this talk, you gave that to us, that you give more clearance on all those different codes. And it dazzles me sometimes as well, that sometimes you work with the European code, sometimes you work with the Dutch code, sometimes you work with another code, and that's or the institution-specific code, and that can be chaotic, to be honest. Let's go for some questions that came in for you. The first one is from Christian Wendelborn, and he has 2 questions. Did you find different conceptions of epistemic norms with regard to consequentialists or more deontologist conceptions? That's the first question. Or is the difference not reflected in codes?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
I think you also have to help the audience, the non-philosophers audience, to enlighten us.
Yeah. So philosophers, they make lots of distinctions, but in this particular case, they make a distinction between consequentialist. I mean, this is originally in ethics. So consequentialist ethics, which says that what the right thing to do is depends on what the consequences are. The better the consequences, I mean, the more it is the right thing to do. Versus deontological norms, which say that what the right thing to do is depends on what your duties and obligations are. So consequences don't necessarily factor into that. It just has to do with the moral law, as it's traditionally called. So in epistemology too, people make that distinction sometimes. So some people say we have epistemic obligations, so we need to follow the argument where it leads, respect the evidence, proportion our belief to what the available evidence is. Perhaps there are sort of norms or obligations for good inquiry, particularly in science. That seems pretty plausible. So methodological standards are an example. Others think epistemic norms or thinking about epistemology can also be done in consequentialist terms, where you simply look at the consequences of following various guidelines and practices. So the consequences, presumably in terms of how many true beliefs ensue or how many false beliefs we get. So this is a great question, and I'm going to be completely honest. We didn't draw that distinction in the paper. I'm going to have to say I need to go back to these codes and look again, because I'm not so, I mean, from what I recall, the different codes simply have elements of both. I mean, there's, sometimes we find guidelines that clearly seem to aim at good consequences. So, I mean, they lend themselves to a consequentialist reading, sorry. But other times, it looks more like it's an obligation. And arguably, I mean, maybe these codes weren't, okay, so I'm hopefully not gonna offend anybody here, but maybe these codes weren't written by, people who are extremely philosophically sophisticated. And maybe the things that are actually in them.
Be careful.
Sorry, this is offensive. But so maybe the things that are in them can actually be defended both from a deontologist and a consequentialist perspective. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, but you enlightened us about the difference, at least, and also about the consequence of these codes themselves. I also wondered when I was listening to you talk about if there are so many different codes and so many perspectives and views, how you see those norms, values, virtues, and so on. Is there a perfect code?
Well, that's another great question. Is there a perfect code? Well, I guess not. I mean, it seems pretty implausible to me, given that there are these rather different elements and sort of multiple elements within the categories of elements, that there would be sort of one uniquely best way of writing it all up and systematizing it. I mean, in a way, that would be sort of the theoretician's dream, right? Sort of a theory of everything for codes of conduct. But I doubt that's going to be feasible. And the reason I'm doubting it in particular is the fact that we found these sort of multiple conflicting and sometimes incommensurable values. And when you run into those, it seems plausible to me that there's not going to be one uniquely correct or best or superior way of codifying these things. So, I mean, I guess, I mean, the thing to say is there are going to be multiple good ways of writing up codes and not one unique way.
And there might be also a difference per discipline or even per country, that a discipline needs different code, a different code than let's say medicine is completely different than philosophy. So I can also imagine that you have to make distinction between that.
Yeah, so that's another interesting question. And I mean, I guess we didn't really find cultural differences between these codes, but that might be something to look at in more detail. Because I mean, obviously, many people have argued that moral guidelines and moral rules, and certainly social customs and habits, differ sometimes pretty wildly between different cultures. So maybe the same could be true of codes for research integrity. I mean, in a way, that would also be slightly disappointing because we like to think of science as this sort of international, universally valid thing. So you would hope that the guidelines and the rules for doing it well or doing it with integrity are going to apply universally too. But I don't think that's a given. I mean, we should look more closely at whether that's actually what we find in codes from different parts of the world.
Yeah, so because you also looked into a code from Zimbabwe, so that may also have different perspectives. So there's another good question, and please send in your questions. They're very fruitful for the discussions. So Josh Hapgood Code asks, did you find in any of these of the codes an explicit discussion of conflicts between different values? I wonder whether it might be, at least maybe, counterproductive to focus too much on conflicts if they don't show up too often. And the main point is to get people to follow the codes.
Yeah, from the top of my head, I think the most recent version, at least of the Dutch code, has some guidelines for how to deal with breaches, but of course that's not quite the same as how to handle sort of conflicts between different values and principles. So as far as I recall, there is very little to no explicit discussion of different conflicts. So whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge at least a possibility of conflict, even when we want people to adhere to these codes and live by them or conduct research by them. It's still going to be important that people realize that sometimes it can be impossible to follow different principles from different categories or within one category strictly into the letter, because there are these trade-offs. So sort of getting people to follow these codes also means alerting them to the possibility of conflict and getting them to think about how to handle these conflicts and what to do in case two or more values conflict. So they need to develop, I think, this sort of sensitivity to possible conflict and sort of thinking tools or sort of reflection tools to deal with these conflicts. I mean, that's not something we can defer to the powers that be. I mean, it's something the researchers themselves should be made aware of.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, still a lot of questions here, so I hope we can discuss them all. Another interesting one, and also that is part of research misconduct, because that's one of the ways how we deal with research misconduct is that we look at the codes, and if there's a violation or a breach of one of the norms or principles or values of within this code. So the question from Katharina Beyer is that plural values play a role here has become very comprehensible to me. But what practical consequences does this have for dealing with suspected cases of scientific misconduct? Who has the authority to decide which value is more important in a specific case?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the difficult thing is there often is no single authority on these issues because, I mean, okay, so it might be the case that there is sort of a formal authority, right? Maybe there's a committee or some sort of scientific, within a university, a scientific integrity committee or even a national body that deals with breaches of codes. So there might be that formal authority, but I mean, it's not as if anyone on the committee or any individual researchers have a God's eye perspective on the different values that are involved and the possible trade-offs. So the actual authorities or the substantive authority, I think, must lie with the scientific community itself, perhaps even more broadly, the scientific community within society. So this, I mean, I do realize that in practical terms, this is a spectacularly unhelpful thing to say, because it just means that, I mean, there's this sort of diffuse authority that's going to need to make up its mind about weighing these different values. So in practice, I mean, what usually happens, of course, is that there is this integrity committee, or there is an ad hoc committee that has to judge whether or not a breach of the code of conduct was serious enough to warrant some sort of punishment or other consequences. Yeah, I mean, that's, in a way, that's just sort of a practical solution that doesn't give sort of a principled answer to where the authority should lie.
Maybe we can also, as I think it's a very interesting question. We're going to discuss research misconduct cases and allegations in the afternoon for today. So it's good that we take the. I will keep in mind to have this question asked by other experts that have been in committees.
Good. Yeah.
Still some other questions. I really like this one from Jenny van der Steen. How do the incommensurable values relate to dilemmas in research practice?
Oh, yeah, that's great. So it may well be that some of these dilemmas indeed involve incommensurable values, because, I mean, the reason why there are dilemmas is that there's no easy solution, right? In a typical dilemma, you have 2 or 3 or even more conflicting options, and there's no straightforward route to argue that one or the other is the best thing or the preferable thing to do. And the reason why that might be the case is exactly because incommensurable, or at least conflicting, values are at stake. So I think, I mean, that's certainly the way philosophers like to think about moral dilemmas. I mean, they often say, well, moral dilemmas do involve these incommensurable values. So I'm inclined to think that applies to research integrity too. When we're dealing with a genuine dilemma, that's because we are dealing with underlying incommensurable values sometimes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Another question from Mariëtte de Boer, and she wonders how international publishers make use of research codes, considering the variety across countries in peer reviewing. Can you elaborate on this?
Oh, yeah, good question. I mean, to be honest, I don't know how publishers deal with this. I mean, maybe we should ask some of the publishers, or at least their representatives, tomorrow on how they deal with this, because honestly, I wouldn't know. But I mean, I do see the worry that these international publishers, they are dealing with scientists who, from all over the world, who could be adhering to sort of slightly different codes of conduct. So it's not always clear. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would think, well, it's complicated, right? Because even with international collaborations, just like with international law, it's sort of difficult, right? When there's a collaboration between scientists from the US and Europe, or Europe and Africa, which code applies to the project as a whole? Or do different codes apply to different parts of the project? That's sort of messy. So maybe this is something the researchers would need to get clear on when they start collaborating. But yeah, good question. I don't have the answer.
Well, the good thing is that coincidentally you are chairing tomorrow's day, the third day of research. Yeah, well, you forgot it. No kidding. No, so the good thing is that we can ask the publishers themselves, because they will come tomorrow. And I think it's a very good question. And I think they have internal policy about research integrity codes, but it's also good to ask their views on it. We have 2 more minutes, so one final question, which takes it also back to practice about those procedural requirements in those procedures about that are dealing with research misconduct cases, and that's from Natalie Trifkovic. How do you view the tension between honoring the procedural requirements to keep confidentiality versus learning from committed research integrity violations in order to evaluate, establish lessons learned, and to prevent future violations?
Right. Okay, so this applies specifically to when a violation has taken place. To what extent should that be made public, and what happened and how we dealt with it? Yeah, that's a really tricky question. I mean, ideally, we do want to learn from things that have gone wrong, but of course, I mean, it's also going to be important that people's privacy is protected.
Yeah.
But that's going to be very hard to do, right? Because once you describe the details of the case, I mean, presumably people who are more or less in the know are going to be able to identify who this person was, or who this group of researchers was. Yeah, so I mean, I guess the best we can do is to either anonymize sort of case descriptions to the extent that they really preclude identifying the individuals involved. And if that's not possible, we should try and draw more general lessons without providing too many details of the particular cases. And maybe that's not going to be as helpful, because the more abstract you get, probably the less guidance it provides. Yeah. But of course, I mean, privacy is a value, and people's privacy needs to be protected.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that answer really resembles with the struggle that the committees have to publish these outcomes of these procedures. So they do publish it, but they really focus on anonymity per se. And it's also a responsibility for both the committees, but also for the people that are involved in such cases. Well, we are. It's time for a short break. We will be back at 11, but before that, I would really like to thank you, Jeroen. I think you gave a beautiful overview of these codes and made it very practical for us. So it gave us more insight from a practical perspective how these different codes really relate to research practices. And I think that was a very good discussion. So I would like to give you a warm round of applause with all the people that are here. Thank you so much for your talk. And for the logistic, we will be back at 11 sharp. So stretch your legs, grab a cup of coffee, look outside, don't check email, relax a little bit, and then you are sharp. Of course, we're Dutch, so we're sharp at 11. We start again with the program. So see you in 50 minutes.